They taught me that my first kill would feel like prayer, that the blade indeed entering flesh would be communion, that blood would be my offering, and death, theirs or mine, would be the Emperor's answer. I was 11 years old when I learned to hold a neural whip. I was 12 when I killed for the first time. I am 19 now, and I have killed 247 times. The Emperor has never answered, not once. So I ask you, what does devotion mean when your God only speaks in silence, and your only prayer is murder? The city burned for 3 days before the order came to evacuate. I remember the color of the sky, not black, but a kind of sick orange that made everything look like it was already ash. My mother held my hand so tightly I thought the bones would break. She kept saying we would be safe once we reached the extraction point. She kept saying the Emperor protects. The Administratum had made an error. That is what the official records would say, years later, when I was permitted to access the sealed files. A clerical mistake in the tithe assessment. Our world, Ossian's Reach, had been marked for increased production quotas that the existing infrastructure could not support. Rather than adjust the quotas or invest in expansion, the Sector Administratum had simply reclassified the planet. No longer a viable agri-world, no longer worth the resources required to maintain. The Exterminatus order was filed under resource reallocation. Efficient, clean, final. We never reached the extraction point. The firestorm moved faster than the evacuation schedule projected. I watched my mother become light and heat, and nothing. I watched 3 million souls become smoke in the span of an afternoon. I survived because I had wandered away from the crowd, because I was small enough to fit inside a drainage pipe that the heat somehow missed. Because the Emperor protects, they would tell me later. Because he had a purpose for me. I was found 6 days after the burning stopped. A death cult pilgrimage had been passing through the sector when the Exterminatus was authorized. They came to the surface to witness the aftermath, to pray among the ruins, to collect the bones of the faithful for their reliquaries. They found me instead, still alive, still breathing, still small enough to be shaped. The woman who pulled me from the pipe wore robes the color of dried blood. Her face was marked with scars that formed patterns, words maybe, in a language I did not know. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Your suffering will become sacred." I did not understand what she meant. I was 11 years old, and everyone I had ever known was dead. Sacred was a word from temple services, something the priests said before we ate. I did not know that sacred could mean what it would come to mean. I did not know that I had just stopped being a child and started being a weapon. The death cult called themselves the Ash Redeemers. They were one of thousands of such groups scattered across the Imperium, religious sects that had evolved their own interpretations of Imperial doctrine, their own methods of worship. The ecclesiarchy tolerated them because they were useful. The Inquisition monitored them because they were dangerous. The Officio Assassinorum occasionally recruited from them because their conditioning produced results that even the formal temples could not replicate. The Ash Redeemers believed that the Emperor spoke through death. Not metaphorically. They believed that every death in his name was a word in a divine language, and that if enough words were spoken, if enough blood was offered, he would finally answer. They had been speaking this language for 6,000 years. The answer had not come. This did not shake their faith. It deepened it. The silence was a test. The silence was holy. The silence meant they had not yet offered enough. They took me to their temple ship, a converted merchant vessel that moved between worlds wherever death had recently occurred. Battlefields, plague sites, execution grounds. Anywhere blood had been spilled in the Emperor's name. They collected relics from these places, bones, weapons, soil soaked in martyrs' blood. Their ship was a floating ossuary, every surface decorated with death. I was given a cell, 4 meters by 4 meters, stone floor, no window, a thin mat to sleep on, a basin for water, nothing else. This was mercy, they told me. This was kindness. I had lost everything, and now I would be given purpose. I would learn to transform suffering into devotion. I would learn the sacred language. The first lesson began the next morning. I was taken to a training chamber where 12 other children stood in a line. All of us were orphans. All of us had been taken from places where the Emperor's justice had been particularly severe. Purged hive cities. Worlds reclaimed from heretics. A boy next to me whispered that he had been found in a mass grave. He had survived by hiding under the bodies of his family for 2 days. The instructor was a woman named Sarah. She was missing her left arm below the elbow. The stump was decorated with scars cut in deliberate patterns. She told us that she had removed the arm herself, an offering to the Emperor on the day she completed her 100th kill. She told us this casually, the way someone might mention the weather. "You are not children anymore," she said. "Children have names. Children have futures. You have neither. You have only purpose." She walked down the line, studying each of us. When she reached me, she stopped. "What is your name?" she asked. I told her. The name my mother had given me. The name I had carried for 11 years. "That name is dead," Sarah said. "Burn it. Forget it. You are not who you were. You are what you will become." She moved on. I stood there, trying to hold on to the syllables of my name, but they were already slipping away, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Within a week, I could not remember if the name had 2 syllables or 3. Within a month, I could not remember if it had started with a hard sound or a soft one. Within a year, I could not remember having had a name at all. This was the first erasure. There would be many more. Training was not training. That word implies skill acquisition, improvement, growth. What we underwent was replacement. They took everything we were and filled the empty spaces with ritual, with doctrine, with movements that were prayers and prayers that were movements. There was no separation between combat and worship. The neural whip was blessed before use. The killing stroke was accompanied by liturgy. Blood was not spilled. It was offered. We woke at the same hour every day, not because of bells or alarms, but because our bodies learned to wake. We recited the litany of the opening blade while we washed. We recited the hymn of sacred purpose while we ate. We recited the prayer of the faithful weapon while we trained. The words became our thoughts. The thoughts became ourselves. The training itself was brutal, but not cruel. Cruelty implies excess, malice, unnecessary harm. Everything that was done to us was considered necessary. We learned to move in ways that defied normal human biomechanics. Joints hyperextended, spines curved impossibly, because pain was temporary and effectiveness was eternal. We learned to interpret our bodies as tools that would wear out and be discarded. We learned that preservation of self was cowardice. We learned that the only honorable outcome was death in service. They taught us 18 different ways to kill with a blade. Each method had a name. Each name was a prayer. The prayer of severing was for targets who needed to die quickly. The prayer of anguish was for targets who needed to suffer. The prayer of mercy was for targets who deserved the Emperor's grace, even in death. We practiced these prayers on servitors first, then on animals, then on condemned prisoners who were brought to the temple ship for our education. I remember the first servitor. It was a humanoid thing, vat-grown, with minimal cognitive function. It stood where it was placed and did not resist when I approached. Sarah stood behind me, guiding my hand. "The blade goes here," she said, positioning my neural whip against the servitor's neck. "Press slowly. Feel the resistance of flesh. This is the moment between life and death. This is where the Emperor listens." I pressed. The neural whip hummed. The servitor collapsed. I felt nothing. No horror, no guilt, but also no transcendence, no sense of divine presence. Just the hum of the weapon and the wet sound of meat falling. "Good," Sarah said. "Again." I killed 7 servitors that day. By the 7th, I had stopped thinking of them as anything but material. By the 7th, my hands no longer shook. This was progress, they told me. This was growth. The animals were harder. A servitor had never been fully alive. An animal was. I killed dogs, cats, livestock. I killed them with the prescribed prayers. I killed them cleanly when required, and slowly when required. I learned that my discomfort was weakness. I learned that weakness was heresy. I learned to recite the prayers louder when the discomfort grew too strong. The condemned prisoners were hardest. They were human. They begged. Some of them tried to explain why they had been condemned. Some of them claimed innocence. We were taught to ignore their words. We were taught that the administratum did not make errors. If they had been marked for death, they deserved death. Our role was not to judge. Our role was to offer. I killed my first human at age 12, a woman convicted of hoarding food during a famine. She wept when they brought her to the training chamber. She wept when Sarah explained what would happen. She wept when I approached with the blade. She stopped weeping when the prayer of severing was completed. Sarah examined the body afterward, checking the precision of the cut, the angle of approach, the efficiency of the kill. She pointed out where I could improve. My stance had been too wide. My follow-through had been too aggressive. Excessive force meant imperfect devotion. Perfect devotion meant perfect economy. "You did well," she said finally. "But you felt something. I saw it in your eyes." I had felt something. Horror, maybe. Or grief. Or recognition that the woman might have been my mother in another life. "That feeling will fade," Sarah said. "It must fade. The Emperor does not need your emotions. He needs your service." She was right. The feeling did fade. Over the next year, I killed 43 more condemned prisoners. By the 20th, I stopped seeing their faces. By the 30th, I stopped hearing their words. By the 40th, they were no different from the servitors or the animals. They were targets. They were offerings. They were the syllables in a language I was learning to speak fluently. My body changed, not through surgery or augmentation, but through discipline and deprivation. We ate only what was necessary. We slept only what was required. We pushed our bodies until they broke. Then the weak died. This was not tragedy. This was selection. The Emperor needed weapons that would not fail. Failure was death. Death was failure only if it came before service was complete. At age 14, I was judged ready for scarification. This was an honor. This was recognition that I had progressed from student to weapon. The scars would mark me as belonging to the Ash Redeemers. They would mark me as having surrendered my body to a purpose greater than survival. The scarification was performed in the temple chamber, in front of the entire cult. I was stripped and made to kneel. The Redeemer priest stood over me with a heated blade. He recited the litany of sacred marking. Then he began to cut. The pattern took 6 hours to complete. Lines and curves across my back, my arms, my chest. The pain was extraordinary. I was not permitted to scream. Screaming implied that the pain was unwanted. The pain was a gift. The pain was proof that I was becoming something other than human. I bit through my tongue. The blood was collected in a bowl. Nothing was wasted. When the scarification was complete, I was shown my reflection in a polished sheet of metal. I did not recognize the person looking back. The child from Ossian's reach was gone. The child who had hidden in a drainage pipe while his mother burned was gone. What remained was a weapon with a face, a prayer with a body. "You are remade," the Redeemer priest said. "You are no longer what you were. You are what you will be until you are nothing." I believed him. I had to believe him, because if he was wrong, if this was not sacred, then everything that had been done to me was simply brutality dressed in ceremony, and I could not survive believing that. The temple ship moved between worlds according to patterns I never fully understood. We would anchor in orbit over a planet where death had recently occurred, a battlefield, a purge site, a world reclaimed from heretics, and the Redeemers would descend to collect relics and recruit new orphans. I watched this cycle repeat dozens of times over the years. The temple ship was never empty. There were always new children. There was always new suffering to harvest. By age 15, I had been selected for advanced training. This meant I had survived longer than most. This meant my conditioning had taken root. I no longer remembered my name. I no longer remembered Ossian's reach, except as a place where fire had fallen from the sky. My memories before the cult were fragments, sensations without context, emotions without objects. I remembered fear. I did not remember what had frightened me. I remembered loss. I did not remember what I had lost. The advanced training was conducted by a man named Kaid. He was one of the oldest members of the cult, perhaps 60 standard years, though his body showed the wear of far more. He moved with a strange, fluid grace, despite obvious injuries. A shattered knee that had never healed properly, ribs that jutted at unnatural angles, fingers that had been broken and reset so many times they curved like claws. He told us that every injury was a prayer, every scar was a word spoken to the Emperor. His body was a text written in pain. Kaed taught us that killing was not the end of devotion. It was the beginning. The kill itself was simple. Anyone could end a life with sufficient force or surprise. What mattered was everything surrounding the kill. The approach, the preparation, the ritual, the aftermath. The kill was a moment. Devotion was a process. "You must understand the grammar before you can speak. The language," he said. "Every kill has structure. Subject, verb, object. You are the subject. The blade is the verb. The target is the object. But grammar alone is not language. Language requires meaning. Meaning requires intention. Your intention is devotion. Your devotion is offered to the Emperor. The Emperor does not answer. This does not mean he does not listen. We were taught to prepare for kills the way priests prepare for holy rites. Before every training exercise, we would fast for 12 hours. This cleared the body of impurities. We would meditate for 2 hours. This cleared the mind of distraction. We would recite the prayer of sacred purpose for 1 hour. This aligned our intention with divine will. Only then were we permitted to kill. The kills themselves became increasingly complex. We graduated from stationary targets to moving targets, from unaware targets to hostile targets, from single targets to multiple targets. Each escalation required new prayers, new rituals, new forms. We learned the prayer of the hunting blade for targets who fled. We learned the prayer of righteous fury for targets who fought back. We learned the prayer of sorrowful duty for targets who were innocent but necessary. That last prayer troubled me. I remember asking Cade how we could kill the innocent and call it devotion. "Innocence is an illusion," he replied. "All humans carry the seed of corruption. All humans are capable of heresy. We do not kill them for what they have done. We kill them for what they might become. This is mercy. This is the greatest devotion, to end a life before it can be corrupted, to offer a soul to the Emperor before the ruinous powers can claim it." The logic was circular. It justified anything. If innocence was an illusion, then no kill could be questioned. If all humans were potentially corrupt, then all deaths were preventative. I understood the logic. I even believed it for a time. Belief was easier than doubt. Doubt required questions. Questions required a self capable of asking. I no longer had that self. I had purpose instead. The neural whip became an extension of my body. I learned to strike without thinking, to target without aiming, to kill without hesitating. The weapon hummed when activated, a sound like insects or distant machinery. I learned to hear that hum as music. I learned to interpret the subtle changes in frequency as the whip encountered resistance. The difference between striking flesh and striking bone. The difference between striking a vital organ and striking something that could be survived. This was not knowledge taught through instruction. This was knowledge earned through repetition. I killed hundreds of times in training. I killed until the act became reflex. But reflexes are not faith. Reflexes are mechanical. Faith requires consciousness, requires choice. I was supposed to believe that every kill was a conscious offering. I was supposed to feel the Emperor's presence in the moment between the blade and the body. I was supposed to experience transcendence. I never did. I killed efficiently. I killed precisely. I killed without hesitation or error. But I never felt anything that could be called divine. The kills felt like work. The prayers felt like memorized lines. The devotion felt like performance. I did not tell anyone this. To admit such a thing would be to admit that my conditioning had failed. To admit that I was flawed. To admit that the years of pain and training and erasure had produced a weapon that functioned but did not believe. I learned to fake belief instead. I learned to modulate my voice during prayers so that they sounded fervent. I learned to position my body during rituals so that I appeared absorbed in devotion. I learned to perform faith because performance was indistinguishable from reality to observers. Only I knew the difference. Only I knew that when I recited the prayers, I felt nothing but the shape of the words in my mouth. At age 16, I began to suspect that others felt the same. There were signs, 2 quick glances during group prayer, momentary hesitations before kills that should have been automatic, careful avoidance of certain questions. We never spoke of it. To speak of doubt was to create doubt. To create doubt was to weaken the collective faith. And the collective faith was all we had. Without it, we were not holy warriors. We were just killers. The scarification ritual was repeated at age 17. New patterns added to the old. The Redeemer priest cut words into my skin, words in High Gothic that I could not read, but that I was told meant instrument of divine will. The pain was immense. I bore it silently. Afterward, I was told that I had proven my devotion. I had earned the right to serve beyond the temple ship. I had earned the right to kill in the Emperor's name in the wider Imperium. This was supposed to be an honor. This was supposed to be the culmination of years of preparation. But standing there, bleeding from fresh cuts, I felt only emptiness. Not relief that the training was over. Not pride that I had succeeded. Just emptiness. A hollow where something should have been. That night, lying on the stone floor of my cell, I tried to pray. Not the scripted prayers of the cult, a prayer of my own. I asked the Emperor if he was there. I asked if he heard me. I asked if the years of pain had meant anything. The silence that answered was absolute. I told myself the silence was a test. I told myself I needed to try harder. I told myself that faith did not require answers. I told myself many things that night. I believed none of them. My first sanctioned kill occurred 3 weeks after my 17th birthday. The temple ship had anchored in orbit over a hive world designated in the records only as Tertius 9. The planet was unremarkable, another industrial world grinding its population into servitude to maintain the Imperium's endless appetite for manufactured goods. The Ash Redeemers had no business there, but a local inquisitor had requested our services. This was not unusual. Death cult assassins were occasionally loaned to Imperial authorities who required killings that were plausibly deniable or spiritually sanctioned. The target was a man named Velus Crane. I was shown his image. Middle-aged, soft features, the look of someone who had never worked with his hands. He was a mid-level administrator in the Planetary Tithe Office. According to the Inquisitor's briefing, Crane had been embezzling for 6 years, skimming a fraction of a percent from the tithes before they were shipped off-world. The amount was insignificant in absolute terms, but the Imperium does not tolerate any deviation from prescribed process. Crane had committed the sin of independence. He had decided, on his own authority, that he could take what belonged to the Emperor. This could not stand. The kill was to be public, not announced, but visible. Crane would be executed in a crowded market square during peak hours. The method would be ritualized to make clear that this was not a criminal act, but a holy one. The witnesses would understand that Crane had not simply been murdered. He had been judged by the Emperor and found wanting. I was briefed by Ked the night before the kill. He explained the route I would take, the timing, the precise prayers I would recite. He explained what Crane's death would mean, not to Crane, who no longer mattered, but to the planet's tithe administrators. They would understand that deviation carried consequences. They would work harder. They would fear more. Fear was a tool. Fear was devotion enforced. "You will feel nothing when you kill him," Kayad said. "This is correct. Emotion is weakness. The blade does not feel. The blade serves. You are a blade in the Emperor's hand." I nodded. This was what I had been taught. This was what I was supposed to believe. That night I fasted. I meditated. I recited the prayer of sacred purpose until the words lost meaning and became pure sound. I prepared my body as I had been trained. I checked my neural whip 17 times, testing the charge, the weight, the balance. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. I did not sleep, not from anxiety, but from discipline. Sleep before a kill was indulgence. I would sleep after if I survived. If I did not survive, I would not need sleep. The descent to Tertius 9 was conducted in a shuttle piloted by one of the cult's servitors. I shared the space with 2 other assassins. We did not speak. Speech would have been unnecessary. We knew our roles. We knew our purpose. Words would have only diluted the silence. The hive city was called Meridian's Reach. It spread across the planet's equator like a scar. 30 kilometers of vertical construction holding 40 million souls. The market square where Crane conducted his daily business was in the mid-hive, accessible to both the working poor and the administrative class. This was where transactions occurred. This was where value was exchanged. This was where Crane would die. I entered the square at the assigned hour. The crowd was thick. Thousands of people moving between stalls, haggling over prices, conducting the small transactions that kept the hive functional. I wore the simple robes of a pilgrim, the neural whip concealed beneath fabric. No one looked at me twice. Pilgrims were common. Pilgrims were harmless. I spotted Crane easily. He stood at a fountain in the square's center, reviewing documents on a data slate. He looked bored. He looked soft. He looked like someone who had never considered that his sins might find him. I approached slowly, timing my movements to the flow of the crowd. 30 meters. 20. 10. Crane looked up. For a moment, our eyes met. He saw me, but he did not see danger. He saw a pilgrim. He saw nothing. 5 meters. I drew the neural whip. The motion was smooth, practiced, perfect. The whip activated with its familiar hum. Crane's expression changed. Confusion first, then understanding, then fear. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to plead. I recited the prayer of severing. The words came automatically, without thought. Emperor, accept this offering. Let this soul serve in death as it failed to serve in life. Let this blood wash away sin. The whip struck. Crane collapsed. The cut was clean, across the throat, severing both arteries and the windpipe. Death would take 7 seconds, long enough for him to understand what had happened. Not long enough to undo it. I stood over him while he died. This was part of the ritual. The witnesses needed to see me. They needed to see that I did not run. They needed to see that I was not ashamed. I was an instrument of divine justice. I had nothing to fear. The crowd reacted slowly. Shock first, then panic. People scattered. Some screamed. Others fled. A few stood frozen, unable to process what they had witnessed. I did not move. I watched Crane's eyes glaze. I watched the blood pool on the stone. I waited for the feeling that was supposed to come. The transcendence, the sense of divine presence, the confirmation that this death had meaning. Nothing came. I felt my own heartbeat. I felt the weight of the whip in my hand. I felt the eyes of the crowd on me. But I did not feel the Emperor. I did not feel sacred. I felt like someone who had just killed a stranger. This was wrong. This was not what I had been taught. The kill was supposed to be communion. The blood was supposed to be sacrament. Instead, it was just blood. Crane was just dead. I turned and walked away. The crowd parted. No one tried to stop me. This was also part of the ritual. The authorities knew what had happened. They knew to allow it. The Inquisitor had arranged everything. I returned to the shuttle. The other assassins were already there. They did not ask how my kill had gone. They did not need to ask. I had survived. The target was dead. That was sufficient. During the ascent back to the temple ship, I tried to pray. I tried to feel gratitude that I had completed my first sanctioned kill. I tried to feel anything that would confirm that the last 6 years of training had been worth it. The silence was absolute. When I returned to the temple ship, Kaid examined me. He checked my hands for tremors. He checked my eyes for signs of trauma. He asked if I had felt the Emperor's presence during the kill. I lied. I told him yes. I told him the kill had felt sacred. I told him I understood now what I was. Good, Kaid said. You will kill many more. Each will deepen your devotion. I nodded. I believed him. I had to believe him, because if the first kill had felt empty, and the next kill would also feel empty, and the kill after that, then what was I? What had I become? That night, I counted the scars on my body. 73 marks. 73 prayers written in pain. I wondered if the Emperor could read them. I wondered if he cared. I killed 2 more targets that year. A heretic preacher on Calcian Prime, a corrupt official on Meridian's Gate. Both kills were clean. Both kills were public. Both kills were ritual. Both kills felt like nothing. I learned to perform belief better. I learned to fake the expressions that others showed after kills. The subtle relaxation, the quiet satisfaction, the sense of purpose fulfilled. I learned to mirror their faith because I could no longer generate my own. By age 18, I had killed 37 times. By age 19, the number was 247. The kills blurred together. The targets stopped having faces. The prayers stopped having meaning. I moved through the motions with perfect efficiency and total emptiness. I never told anyone. I continued to serve. I continued to kill. I continued to pray. And the Emperor continued to remain silent. At 19 years old, I was loaned to Inquisitor Halleck of the Ordo Hereticus. This was considered a significant honor. Inquisitors rarely requested specific death cult assassins, preferring to select from a pool of available assets. That Halleck had asked for me by designation code suggested that my previous kills had been noticed, that my efficiency had been recognized, that I was valuable. The briefing was conducted aboard Halleck's ship, a modified frigate called the Solemn Penance. I had never been aboard an inquisitorial vessel before. The architecture was different from the temple ship, cleaner, more austere, with none of the ossuary decorations that marked Redeemer spaces. Everything was functional. Everything served a purpose that was visible and clear. Halleck herself was a tall woman with augmetic eyes that clicked when they focused. She looked at me the way someone might look at a tool being evaluated for purchase, not hostile, not kind, simply assessing. "You are designated Hymnal 7, she said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "Yes, Inquisitor," I replied. "Your record indicates 183 sanctioned kills over 3 years. Efficiency rating of 97%. No failures, no deviations from protocol. Is this accurate?" "Yes, Inquisitor." She studied me for another moment, then nodded. "You will be deployed to Gast's Landing, a mining colony in the Caledon sector. Intelligence indicates a Genestealer cult infestation in the lower mining levels. The cult is estimated at 300 individuals. Standard purge doctrine would require a full Imperial Guard regiment. We do not have time for standard doctrine. You and Nedomi Gona and 9 other assets will eliminate the cult leaders. Without leadership, the remaining cultists will scatter or surrender. Acceptable casualties are estimated at 90%. I understood what she was telling me. I understood that acceptable casualties meant my casualties. 9 out of 10 of us would die. This was expected. This was the mission parameter. "Understood, Inquisitor," I said. "You will depart in 6 hours. Prepare accordingly." I was dismissed. I returned to the small chamber I had been assigned and began the rituals. Fasting, meditation, prayer. But the prayers felt more hollow than usual. 90% casualties. 9 out of 10 would die. The math was simple. The mission was a suicide deployment dressed in tactical language. I wondered if the other assets understood this. I wondered if they cared. Death was supposed to be our purpose. Death was supposed to be our offering. To fear death was to admit that our conditioning had failed. I did not fear death, but I did not welcome it either. I felt nothing about it. No anticipation, no dread. Just acknowledgement that it was likely and that my opinion was irrelevant. The other 9 assets were drawn from various death cults across the sector. 2 were Ash Redeemers, like myself. The other 7 represented traditions I did not recognize. Different scars, different prayer styles, different weapons. We met in the deployment bay 6 hours later. No introductions were made. No camaraderie was established. We were not a team. We were 10 individual offerings being made simultaneously. The descent to Gast's Landing was conducted in silence. The shuttle pilot, a servitor with half its brain removed, navigated through the planet's toxic atmosphere without deviation. The mining colony appeared through the viewport as we descended. A sprawl of prefabricated structures clinging to the side of a mountain, surrounded by mining equipment that looked centuries old. We landed at the colony's edge, far from the main settlement. The Inquisitor's intelligence suggested that the cult leadership operated from the deepest mining levels, 3 kilometers below the surface. We would need to descend through the mine, shafts, through territory, where the cultists had prepared defenses. The squad leader, an assassin from a cult called the Ember Faithful, outlined the approach. We would move in pairs, using separate shafts to avoid concentrated resistance. Once we reached the lower levels, we would converge on the cult's central chamber. We would kill the leaders. We would extract if possible. No one asked what "if possible" meant. We all understood it meant probably not. I was paired with one of the other Ash Redeemers, a woman designated Hymnal 12. We had trained together, but had never spoken beyond ritual responses. She was older than me, perhaps 25, with scars that covered her entire face. She moved with the fluid grace that marked advanced conditioning. We entered the mine shaft assigned to us. The descent was steep, the air growing hotter and thinner with each meter. Mining equipment lined the walls, ancient drills, ore processors, conveyor systems that had been shut down when the infestation was discovered. Everything was coated in dust and rust. The first cultists appeared at the 2-kilometer depth. They were waiting in ambush, hidden behind OPA or containers. They looked human at first glance, but their eyes were wrong. Too large, too dark, and their movements were too coordinated. They attacked as one, with tactics that no civilian miners should have possessed. I killed 3 in the first engagement. Hymnal 12 killed 2. The neural whips hummed. The prayers were recited. The blood was offered. We moved forward. More cultists. More kills. The mine shaft became a descent through violence. I stopped counting after the 20th kill. The targets blurred together. They stopped being individuals and became obstacles to be removed. At the 3-kilometer depth, we met the other pairs. 5 had survived the descent. 5 had not. 50% casualties already, and we had not yet reached the cult leadership. The central chamber was vast, a natural cavern that the miners had expanded for equipment storage. The cult had converted it into something else. The walls were covered in biomass, organic material that pulsed and moved. In the center of the chamber stood the cult leaders, 3 figures that were barely human anymore. Their bodies had been transformed by genestealer infestation. Extra limbs, chitinous armor, claws that gleamed in the dim light. They saw us. They smiled. They did not speak words, but emitted sounds that bypassed language and went straight to instinct. Sounds that said predator, sounds that said run. We did not run. We attacked. The fight was brief and brutal. The cult leaders moved faster than anything human. They moved like the genestealers that had spawned them. 2 more assassins died in the first 10 seconds. A third died moments later. Hymnal 12 and I flanked the nearest leader. She struck high. I struck low. The neural whips hummed. The leader screamed. A sound. That was human and Xenos simultaneously. It collapsed. The remaining 2 leaders charged. I barely avoided the claws. Hymnal 12 was not as fast. The claws took her across the chest, opening her from collarbone to hip. She fell without sound. 3 assassins remained. We killed the second leader through coordinated strikes. The third leader wounded another assassin before we brought it down. 2 of us remained standing. Me and an assassin from the Ember Faithful, designated Ash 3. We stood among the bodies, ours and theirs. The mission was complete. The cult leadership was dead. We had succeeded. We had also lost 80% of our force, better than the projected 90%, but not by much. Ash 3 and I climbed back through the mine shaft in silence. The ascent took 6 hours. My body screamed with exhaustion and minor injuries. I ignored it. Pain was irrelevant. When we reached the surface, an inquisitorial transport was waiting. We were taken back to the solemn penance. Inquisitor Halleck examined us briefly, nodded, and dismissed us with a single word: adequate. 8 assassins had died. The mission had succeeded. The result was adequate. I returned to my chamber. I cleaned my neural whip. I treated my wounds. I lay on the narrow cot and tried to sleep. Instead, I replayed the mission. I remembered Hymnal 12 falling. I remembered the cult leader's inhuman speed. I remembered 8 deaths that had been expected, anticipated, built into the mission parameters. I wondered if the Emperor had noticed. I wondered if 8 offerings had been accepted. I wondered if the silence that followed the mission was approval or indifference. I did not know. I would never know. But I was alive. And according to the mission parameters, I should not have been. The solemn penance remained in the Caledon sector for 3 more months. Inquisitor Halleck was conducting a broader investigation into suspected genestealer infiltration across multiple worlds. I was not privy to the details. My role was simple: remain available for deployment when required. Between missions, I was given minimal duties. I maintained my equipment. I trained in the ship's small combat chamber. I performed the rituals that maintained conditioning. But there were hours each day with nothing to fill them. This was unusual. The temple ship had structured every moment. Idleness had not existed. Here, aboard an inquisitorial vessel, I discovered what idleness felt like. It felt like threat. Without constant activity, thoughts intruded. Questions that I had been trained to ignore suddenly had space to form. I found myself remembering things I should not have remembered, fragments of the child I had been before the Ash Redeemers. A woman's voice singing, the smell of grain fields, the color of 3 moons hanging in the sky. I recognized these memories as dangerous. They suggested that the erasure had been incomplete. They suggested that something of my previous self still existed beneath the conditioning. This was weakness. This was flaw. I tried to suppress the memories through increased training. I would spend 8 hours each day in the combat chamber, repeating the forms until exhaustion forced the thoughts away. It worked, but only temporarily. The memories always returned during the quiet hours. One evening, I was in the ship's observation deck, a small chamber with a viewport looking out into the void. The Inquisition did not encourage such spaces. Contemplation of the cosmos was considered potentially dangerous. But the Solemn Penance was an old ship, and some architectural choices from a more permissive era remained. I stood at the viewport, looking at nothing in particular, when I heard voices approaching. I moved to leave. Inquisitorial personnel typically avoided death cult assets when possible, and I had learned not to intrude on their spaces, but the voices were too close. Leaving would mean passing directly by them. So I remained still, hoping to be overlooked. 3 figures entered the observation deck. All wore the uniform of the Inquisitorial Guard. Well-trained soldiers drawn from various Imperial Guard regiments. They were off-duty, speaking casually in the way that soldiers do when no officers are present. They did not notice me immediately. They moved to the viewport and stood looking out at the stars. One of them, a man with gray in his beard, spoke first. 3 more months in this sector. Emperor, help us. Could be worse, another replied. A woman with a cybernetic arm. Could be a chaos incursion. Could be better too, the third added. A younger man, perhaps 20. Could be garrison duty on some paradise world. They laughed. It was a tired sound, but genuine. The sound of people who had found small moments of comfort despite their circumstances. The older man noticed me then. He tensed, his hand moving toward his sidearm before he registered that I was not a threat. Just an asset. Just a death cult assassin standing in a corner. Didn't see you there, he said. Not friendly. Not hostile. Just acknowledgement. I nodded. I did not speak. Speech would have invited interaction. But the younger man was curious. You're one of the cult assassins, right? The ones who went to Gast's Landing? I nodded again. Heard only 2 of you made it back, he continued. Must have been bad down there. It was adequate, I replied. The word Inquisitor Halleck had used. The word that meant 8 deaths and 2 survivals, and a mission complete. The older man shook his head. Adequate. Emperor's mercy. What a word for losing 80% of your squad. They were not a squad, I said. They were offerings. The 3 guards exchanged glances. The woman with the cybernetic arm spoke carefully. Offerings. You mean they were supposed to die? Death in service is the purpose, I replied. Life is temporary. Service is eternal. The younger man looked uncomfortable. But you survived. Does that mean you failed? The question was naive. It was also precise. It cut to the core of what I had been avoiding for months. I do not know, I said. Silence followed. The guards clearly did not know how to respond. They had expected rote doctrine. They had not expected honesty. The older man cleared his throat. Well, glad you made it back anyway. The Inquisitor seemed pleased with the result. They left soon after, returning to whatever off-duty activities they had planned. I remained at the viewport, alone again. But their words lingered. Glad you made it back. The words implied that survival had value beyond tactical outcome. That a life continuing was worth acknowledging. This was not a concept the Ash Redeemers taught. Life had no inherent value. Only purpose granted value. And purpose required death. but the guard had been glad I survived. Not because my survival served a function, simply because survival was preferable to death. I tried to dismiss the thought. I tried to remind myself that these were unaugmented humans with incomplete understanding of devotion. Their opinions were irrelevant. The thought did not dismiss. It stayed, like a splinter embedded too deep to remove. Over the following weeks, I found myself observing the inquisitorial guard more carefully. During training exercises, during meals in the communal areas, during the small moments when they thought themselves unobserved. I watched how they interacted with each other, the casual gestures of friendship, the shared jokes, the way they would check on each other after difficult missions. They cared about each other's survival, not because doctrine demanded it, not because efficiency required it. They simply cared. I had never experienced such care. The Ash Redeemers did not form attachments. Attachment was weakness. We were weapons, not friends. When Hymnal 12 had died on Gast's Landing, I had felt nothing. I had been trained to feel nothing. Her death was her purpose fulfilled. But watching the guards mourn a comrade who died during a boarding action, watching them gather in the observation deck and share memories and grieve openly, I felt something I could not name. Not grief, exactly. I had not known their comrade, but something adjacent to grief. Recognition of what I had been denied, understanding of what I had lost when my name was burned away. I tried to pray that night. I tried to tell the Emperor that I was struggling with doubts. I tried to ask for guidance. The silence was absolute. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time since joining the Ash Redeemers, I allowed myself to question whether the silence meant anything, whether the Emperor's lack of response was a test or simply absence. The question terrified me, because if it was absence, if I had killed 247 people for a god who did not listen, then everything I had become was built on nothing. I forced the question away. I recited the prayer of sacred purpose until the words became noise. I performed the rituals until exhaustion forced sleep. But the question remained. Silent, persistent, growing. Inquisitor Halleck released me from service 3 months later. The investigation in the Caledon sector had concluded. The Genestealer infestation had been purged. My services were no longer required. I returned to the temple ship aboard a commercial transport, traveling alone. This was unusual. Death cult assassins typically moved in groups when being transferred between assignments. But Halleck had arranged for discreet transport. I was property being returned to its owners, and property did not require escort. The journey took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of solitude in a small cabin aboard a ship carrying mining equipment and agricultural supplies. 2 weeks with nothing to do but maintain my equipment and perform rituals. 2 weeks to think. The questions that had begun aboard the solemn penance had grown stronger. I could no longer suppress them through activity. They were there when I woke. They were there when I tried to sleep. They filled every quiet moment. I tried to pray. I tried to feel the Emperor's presence. I tried to convince myself that the years of training, the scars, the kills, all of it had meaning. Nothing came. Just silence. I began to experiment. I would pray with perfect devotion, reciting the liturgies exactly as taught. Silence. I would pray with deliberately imperfect form, testing whether the Emperor responded to error. Silence. I would pray with anger, demanding answers. Silence. I would pray with desperation, begging for any sign. Silence. The silence was total and unchanging. It did not vary based on my devotion. It did not respond to my doubt. It simply was. By the time the transport arrived at the temple ship's coordinates, I had reached a conclusion I could not escape. The Emperor did not answer because the Emperor was not listening. Not to me, perhaps not to anyone. This should have destroyed my faith. This should have broken me. But it did not. Because faith, I realized, was not about the Emperor's response. Faith was about my continued service, despite his silence. I could not stop serving because I no longer knew how to be anything else. The conditioning had been too thorough. I was a weapon. Weapons did not question their purpose. They simply functioned until they broke. I returned to the temple ship and resumed my duties. I trained, I killed, I prayed. But the prayers had changed. They were no longer offering spoken with hope of response. They were simply words I said, because saying them was what I did. The Redeemer priest noticed the change. During a routine inspection, he studied my scars and asked if I had been wounded during my service to the Inquisitor. "No," I replied. "But you are different," he said. "Your movements are correct. Your prayers are correct. But something has changed." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. He studied me for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "You have learned what we all learn eventually. The Emperor's silence is not absence. It is presence too vast to be comprehended. He does not answer, because we are not asking the right questions. Continue your service. The understanding will come." I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him, but the words felt hollow. Over the following months, I killed 17 more targets. Corporate officials skimming tithes, heretic preachers spreading unapproved doctrine, a psyker who had manifested without sanction. Each kill was performed with perfect technical execution. Each kill felt like nothing. I began to observe the other Redeemers more carefully. I watched for signs that they felt what I did not feel. Some showed genuine fervor during prayers. Others showed the same mechanical devotion that I performed. I could not tell which were believers and which were performers. Perhaps there was no difference. Perhaps belief and performance became indistinguishable after enough repetition. At age 20, I participated in a mass ritual, a ceremony where the entire cult gathered to offer prayers and bloodletting. We stood in the temple chamber, hundreds of us, and opened small wounds in our palms. The blood was collected in a central basin, while we recited the litany of sacred offering. I performed my part, flawlessly. I recited the words. I bled into the basin. But I felt nothing sacred, just the pain of the cut and the repetition of familiar syllables. Afterward, several younger Redeemers approached me. They had heard of my service to an Inquisitor. They wanted to know what it felt like to kill in such direct service to Imperial authority. They wanted to know if I had felt the Emperor more strongly when serving the Inquisition. I lied. I told them yes. I told them the kills had felt more sacred. I told them what they wanted to hear. They looked at me with something like awe. They saw devotion in my words. They saw faith. They did not see the emptiness. That night, I tried a different prayer, not one from the liturgies, not one I had been taught. I simply asked, "If you are there, show me. If this has meaning, let me know. If I am more than a weapon, give me a sign." The silence was absolute. I lay on the stone floor of my cell and allowed myself, for the first time in years, to cry. Not from grief, not from despair, just from exhaustion. The exhaustion of maintaining faith without foundation. The exhaustion of pretending devotion I did not feel. The exhaustion of being a weapon that had learned to question its purpose but could not stop fulfilling that purpose regardless. The tears dried. I performed the evening rituals. I prepared for the next day's duties. Nothing changed. Nothing would change. I would continue to serve. I would continue to kill. I would continue to pray to a God who did not answer. Because I had no choice. Because I had been made into something that could only function within the structure of service. Because the alternative, admitting that the conditioning had made me into a broken tool, was unbearable. The Emperor remained silent, and I remained his hollow instrument. At age 21, I was reassigned. This was communicated through a simple data slate delivered to my cell. No explanation, no ceremony, just new orders. I was to report to the Scholastica Psychana on Terra. The Scholastica was the Imperium's primary training facility for psychers, children and adults whose connection to the warp made them both valuable and dangerous. They required protection from forces that would exploit their abilities. Death cult assassins occasionally served as guards at such facilities, providing security that was both effective and expendable. This was a demotion, not stated, but clear. Inquisitorial service had been active deployment. Temple ship service had been active deployment. Guard duty was passive. It was a role for assets that were no longer trusted for primary missions. I did not question the reassignment. Questions were not permitted. I gathered my minimal possessions, my neural whip, my robes, nothing else, and reported to the transport coordinates. The journey to Terra took 4 months. 4 months aboard a naval vessel, traveling the well-protected routes of the inner systems. 4 months of isolation in a small cabin, performing rituals that felt increasingly mechanical. Terra itself was overwhelming. The throne world, humanity's birthplace, the seat of the Emperor's physical form. Every surface covered in construction, every space filled with purpose. Billions upon billions of souls living in service to the vast machinery of the Imperium. I saw almost none of it. The transport delivered me directly to the Scholastica's orbital facility. I was processed through security, given a brief orientation, and assigned to my post. The Scholastica Psychana was a fortress designed to contain power. Psychic dampening fields permeated every corridor. Null servitors patrolled constantly. The architecture was deliberately oppressive. Low ceilings, narrow halls, constant surveillance. The psychers training here were not students. They were resources being refined for Imperial use. My assignment was simple. Patrol designated corridors. Observe assigned training chambers. Report anomalies. Respond to containment breaches with lethal force. It was mindless work. Work that required no thought, no skill, no devotion. Just presence and compliance. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The routine was absolute and unchanging. I woke at the same hour. I patrolled the same corridors. I observed the same training sessions. I returned to my small quarters. I slept. The cycle repeated. No one spoke to me. The Scholastica staff avoided death cult assassins when possible. We were weapons kept in reserve, disturbing reminders of what the Imperium was willing to do when psychic assets became liabilities. The psychers in training feared us. The instructors tolerated us. No one wanted us there, but everyone acknowledged we were necessary. I watched the psychers during their training sessions. Children mostly. Some as young as 8 or 9, they were taught to control their powers through a combination of discipline and terror. Those who learned quickly advanced to useful roles: astropaths, sanctioned psychers, advisors. Those who learned slowly were eliminated before they could become dangerous. I witnessed 7 eliminations during my first year. 7 children whose control had faltered. 7 deaths that were necessary and efficient and absolutely routine. Each elimination was performed by silent custodians, hooded figures who appeared, executed the failed psyker, and departed without explanation. The remaining students would be assembled afterward and made to recite litanies of control for 6 hours. Some collapsed from exhaustion. They did not return. I observed all of this with perfect detachment. These deaths were not my responsibility. I was only there to ensure the facility's security. If the psychers died during training, that was training proceeding as designed. But I found myself thinking about the eliminations during the empty hours. Thinking about the children's faces. Thinking about how their deaths were considered necessary maintenance of a system that required psychic power, but could not tolerate its instability. I began to see patterns. The Imperium functioned through the constant sacrifice of its own. Death cult assassins trained from childhood to die in service. Psychers selected and culled to produce useful assets. Imperial Guard regiments ground down in endless wars. Everywhere, human life measured only by its utility. The Ash Redeemers had taught me that death was sacred, that offering life to the Emperor was the highest devotion. But watching the Scholastica's systematic elimination of failed students, I began to wonder if sacred was simply the word used to justify expendability. I had been trained to see my own death as meaningful, as purpose fulfilled. But what if death was just death? What if the liturgies and rituals were just decoration on top of simple brutality? What if the Emperor's silence was not mystery, but indifference? These thoughts were dangerous. I recognized them as dangerous. I tried to suppress them through increased devotion. I would recite prayers for hours. I would perform the scarification rituals more frequently than required. I would volunteer for additional duties. None of it helped. The thoughts persisted. In my 3rd year at the Scholastica, I witnessed an incident that crystallized everything. A young psyker, perhaps 9 years old, manifested a surge of telekinetic power during a training session. She was scared, not malicious. She was trying to control the power, but it overwhelmed her. A data slate was propelled across the chamber, striking an instructor and breaking his arm. The response was immediate. Silent custodians appeared. The girl was seized. She was dragged from the chamber, screaming. She was executed in an adjacent room. I heard the bolt pistol discharge. The remaining students were assembled. They were made to recite the litany of control for 6 consecutive hours. 2 collapsed. They were removed. They did not return. I stood guard during the entire process. I stood motionless, performing my role. But I could not stop thinking about the girl's face, about her terror, about how she had committed no crime except being unable to perfectly control abilities she had never asked for. The Imperium called this justice, called this necessity, called this the price of maintaining humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy. I had believed that once. I had believed that the sacrifices were meaningful, that the deaths served purpose, that the Emperor received these offerings and valued them. But standing in that training chamber, watching children recite litanies until they collapsed, I could no longer maintain belief. The system did not need belief. It needed compliance. And compliance did not require that the sacrifices be meaningful, only that they be performed. That night, I tried to pray. I tried to tell the Emperor that I was losing faith, that I needed confirmation that the years of service had mattered, that the deaths, mine and others, had meaning beyond efficiency. The silence was absolute. I realized then that it would always be silent. that no amount of devotion would produce an answer, that faith without evidence was not virtue. It was simply the inability to accept that meaning might not exist. I continued my duties. I patrolled the corridors. I observed the training sessions. I watched more children die. I said nothing, because what could I say? I was a weapon. Weapons did not question their use. They simply functioned until they broke. And I was broken. Had been broken for years, perhaps. But I was still functional, still capable of service. So I served. The Emperor remained silent, and I remained his hollow instrument, going through motions I no longer believed in, because belief had never been required. Only obedience. 7 years. 7 years at the Scholastica Psychana. 7 years of watching children die and psychers fail, and the Imperial machinery grind souls into resources. 7 years of silence. I am 28 years old now. I have killed 416 times. I have recited prayers tens of thousands of times. I have performed every ritual, followed every doctrine, maintained every form. The Emperor has never answered. Not once. I know now what I have always known, but could not admit. The silence is not mystery. The silence is not test. The silence is simply silence. The Emperor does not listen to death cult assassins. Perhaps he does not listen to anyone. Perhaps the entire structure of devotion, the prayers, the offerings, the sacred language of violence, is simply what we tell ourselves to justify what we do. I killed a man on Tertius 9 when I was 17. I killed him in the Emperor's name. I recited the prayer of severing. I watched him die. I waited for confirmation that his death had meaning. Nothing came. I have killed 415 more since then. Nothing has changed. The kills are still empty. The prayers are still mechanical. The devotion is still performance. But I continue, because I was made into something that can only continue. The conditioning was too thorough. The erasure was too complete. I am a weapon that has learned it is a weapon, but a weapon cannot stop being a weapon simply through awareness. I know what I am. I know what was taken from me. I know that the child who hid in a drainage pipe while his world burned would not recognize what he became. I know that the name I once carried is gone forever, burned away in rituals that promised meaning, but delivered only emptiness. I know all of this, and I serve anyway, because there is no alternative. Because stopping would mean confronting the full weight of what was done to me. Because continuing is easier than admitting that it was all for nothing. I stand guard in these corridors. I watch psychers die. I perform my duties with perfect efficiency. And I pray, not because I believe the Emperor hears, but because the act of praying is what I do. Because the prayers are the only language I speak fluently anymore. Last night, I tried something different. Instead of asking the Emperor for a sign, I simply acknowledged the silence. I said, I know you do not answer. I know you are not there, or you are there and do not care. I know my devotion is meaningless, but I will continue anyway. Not for you, for lack of anything else. The silence that followed was absolute, but for the first time, the silence felt honest. I am a death cult assassin. I am the Emperor's hollow instrument. I was shaped from a child's grief into a weapon that kills in his name. I have no name. I have no past. I have no future beyond service that will end in death. And the God I serve has never once acknowledged that I exist. This is what devotion means. Not transcendence, not communion, just the performance of sacred violence for a God who does not answer, continued not because it is meaningful, but because I have been made incapable of anything else. They taught me that my first kill would feel like prayer. They were wrong, but I continue to pray anyway, because I am a weapon, and weapons do not stop.